The conference room smelled like expensive leather and broken promises when I walked in to sign the acquisition papers. I am Petra Vance, 31 years old, and today I was about to become the majority shareholder of Consolidated Media Group, the very company that had employed my former classmates, the same people who'd laughed when I dropped out of business school 5 years ago, the same people who'd told me I was throwing my life away. The irony tasted sweeter than the complimentary espresso they'd placed in front of me. I could see them through the glass wall, those familiar faces now pale with recognition, clustered around desks in the open-plan office like birds who just spotted a hawk circling overhead. Monica Chen sat frozen at her cubicle, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She'd been the ringleader back then, the one who'd organized that infamous farewell party where everyone had taken turns roasting my decision to leave. Dylan Park stood by the water cooler, the smug smile he'd worn for 5 years finally cracking at the edges. And there was James Wu, the golden boy who'd graduated top of our class, now staring at me through 2 panes of glass and 5 years of miscalculation. But let me take you back to where this really started, because the best revenge stories don't begin with triumph. They begin with humiliation so complete, so public, that it becomes the fuel for everything that follows. If you want the full truth about what happened next, hit like so this story reaches more people who have been underestimated. 5 years ago, I was 26, halfway through my MBA at Preston Business School, one of those elite programs where tuition costs more than most people's cars, and the networking opportunities are supposed to set you up for life. My classmates were the children of executives, legacy admissions, people who'd never questioned whether they belonged in boardrooms because boardrooms had been their playground since childhood. I was different. I'd worked 3 jobs to save for that program. I'd studied until my eyes burned. I'd earned my place at that table, but I'd never quite fit the mold. Where they saw business as a game of connections and cocktail parties, I saw it as systems and patterns, problems waiting for elegant solutions. That fundamental difference is what led me to the idea. I'd been working on a media analytics platform as a side project, something I'd started almost accidentally while helping a friend's struggling podcast figure out why their downloads had plateaued. What I discovered was that every analytics tool on the market was asking the wrong questions. They were measuring vanity metrics, downloads, and page views, when what actually mattered was engagement depth, conversion pathways, and predictive audience behavior modeling. I'd built a prototype in my apartment, coding late into the night after classes, surviving on instant ramen and the kind of obsessive focus that only comes when you've stumbled onto something real. The platform could predict with 87% accuracy which content would go viral, which audience segments would convert to paid subscribers, and which creators were about to break through. It was revolutionary. It was also eating all my time, all my energy, and making it increasingly impossible to pretend I cared about corporate finance case studies and marketing theory I'd already proven wrong in practice. Comment justice if you believe she deserved to become their boss. So I made the decision. I was going to drop out, take the investor meeting I'd secretly arranged, and build this thing properly. I was going to risk everything on the belief that what I'd created mattered more than the credential I was halfway toward earning. I thought my classmates would understand, or at least respect the entrepreneurial spirit they were supposedly being trained to cultivate. I was catastrophically wrong. The farewell party happened 3 days after I'd submitted my withdrawal paperwork. Monica had organized it under the guise of a friendly send-off, booked a private room at Sterling's, the overpriced bar where our cohort gathered every Thursday to network and get expensively drunk. I should have known something was wrong when I walked in and saw the banner. It read, "Good luck in the real world, Petra." But the way Monica had positioned it, the letters formed a subtle secondary message that spelled out failure. Clever and cruel, exactly Monica's style. The speeches started after the second round of drinks, when everyone was loose enough to say what they really thought but sober enough to remember it later, to turn it into an anecdote they de-recycle at future networking events. Dylan went first, raising his glass with that practiced charm he'd probably learned from his CEO father. "Here, to Petra," he announced, grinning like this was all in good fun. "The bravest, or maybe the most foolish person in our class. She's trading a guaranteed 6-figure salary and a degree from Preston for a coding project and a dream. We'll miss you, Petra. Try not to miss us too much when you're debugging at 3 a.m. in your studio apartment. Type yes if you want to see the moment they realized who their new owner was. Everyone laughed. Not polite laughter. Real, genuine amusement at the image he'd painted, the cautionary tale I was becoming. James Wu stood next, his expression sympathetic in that performative way that made it worse somehow. I actually admire what you're doing, Petra, he said, his voice dripping with concern. It takes real courage to walk away from something this valuable. Most people wouldn't have the guts. Of course, most people also wouldn't have the need to prove themselves this badly. But hey, if your app thing doesn't work out, I'm sure Preston would let you reapply. Maybe in a few years when you've gotten this out of your system. The laughter was louder this time, encouraged by his casual cruelty dressed up as kindness. Monica delivered the final blow. She stood up, her designer heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. I got Petra a little gift, she announced, pulling out a professionally wrapped box. I wanted it to be something practical, something she could use in her new life. She handed me the box. I opened it because refusing would have looked weak, would have confirmed everything they were implying about my inability to handle the pressure. Inside was a barista apron from a generic coffee chain and a name tag that read Petra, MBA dropout. The room erupted. People were doubled over, slapping tables, wiping tears from their eyes. It was the funniest thing they'd seen all semester, this perfect encapsulation of what happens when someone reaches beyond their station, when someone mistakes desperation for vision. I stood there holding that apron, feeling my face burn, feeling something calcify inside my chest. Not shame, though they wanted that. Something colder, something infinitely more useful. Clarity. I smiled. I thanked Monica for the gift. I told them all I'd see them around. And then I walked out of Sterling, with my head high and a promise forming in the back of my mind like a crystal growing in supersaturated solution. I would make them remember this night. Not as the time they'd put me in my place, but as the biggest miscalculation of their professional lives. If you want the full truth about what happened next, hit like so this story reaches more people who have been underestimated. The investor meeting happened 4 days later in a modest office in the financial district. I'd expected maybe 2 people, a junior partner who'd take notes and someone senior who'd listen for 15 minutes before declining politely. Instead, I walked into a room with 6 people, including Sarah Chen, a legendary venture capitalist who'd built 3 unicorn companies and had a reputation for seeing opportunities that other investors missed. I set up my laptop, pulled up my prototype, and started talking. I didn't use the polished pitch deck I'd prepared. Instead, I showed them the raw data, the patterns I'd discovered, the predictive models that were consistently outperforming every comparable analytics platform on the market. I showed them case studies, small creators I'd helped who'd gone from hundreds of followers to hundreds of thousands in months by understanding what my platform revealed about their audience behavior. And then I showed them the revenue model, the tiered subscription structure that would scale from independent creators to enterprise media companies, the API licensing potential, the data marketplace implications. I talked for 47 minutes straight. When I finished, the room was silent. Sarah Chen leaned forward, her fingers steepled under her chin. "How much are you asking for?" $2 million for 15% equity, I said. The number I'd calculated and recalculated, the amount that would let me build the team I needed, scale the infrastructure, and reach profitability within 18 months. She didn't hesitate. "I'll give you $3 million for 12%, she said, "but I want board representation and monthly strategy sessions." You're sitting on something that could redefine how digital media understands its audiences. I don't want to just invest in this. I want to help you build it into something that makes the major players nervous. I signed the term sheet that afternoon. Within a week, I'd assembled my core team, 3 brilliant engineers I'd met through coding forums, a designer who understood that interfaces should feel intuitive, not impressive, and a data scientist who'd left Google because she was bored solving problems that didn't matter. We called the company Prism Analytics. The name reflected what we did, taking the white light of raw data and separating it into its component insights, revealing patterns that had always been there but invisible to conventional analysis tools. The first year was brutal. 18-hour days, sleeping on couches in our shared office space, eating whatever food someone's partner had dropped off, learning to code faster, think clearer, pivot harder. We landed our first major client 8 months in, a mid-sized podcast network that was struggling to compete with larger players. Within 3 months of implementing Prism, their revenue had increased 340%. Their audience hadn't grown dramatically, but they were monetizing it 5 times more effectively because they finally understood who was actually listening, what those listeners valued, and how to convert passive audience into active customers. That case study became our calling card. Word spread through media industry circles, the way it always does when someone solves a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. We started getting inbound requests, YouTube creators who'd plateaued, newsletter publishers who couldn't figure out why their open rates were declining, streaming platforms that were hemorrhaging subscribers to competitors. Each client we took on generated data that made our models smarter, more accurate, more valuable. By year 2, we had 847 clients and revenue of $12 million. By year 3, we'd raised a Series B round at a valuation of $190 million, and I owned 64% of the company after dilution. I was wealthy on paper, but more importantly, I was building something that mattered, something that was changing how an entire industry functioned. I didn't think about my former classmates much during those years. I was too busy building, too focused on the next milestone, the next technical challenge, the next impossible thing we were going to make possible. But occasionally, I'd see their names pop up on LinkedIn, carefully curated updates about promotions and achievements that seemed impressive, until you realized they were just climbing predetermined ladders in predetermined directions. Monica Chen had joined Consolidated Media Group as a junior marketing strategist. Dylan Park was in corporate development at the same company. James Wu had gone to a prestigious consulting firm for 2 years before Consolidated had recruited him as a VP of Strategic Initiatives, whatever that meant. They were doing exactly what Preston Business School had trained them to do, following the path, collecting the credentials, building careers that looked good on paper and felt hollow in practice. Consolidated Media Group itself was a legacy player, one of those companies that had been important in the previous decade, but was slowly becoming irrelevant as digital disrupted everything they'd built their business model around. They owned a portfolio of regional news outlets, some trade publications, a couple of struggling podcasts, and a YouTube network that was bleeding creators to more nimble competitors. Their stock price had been declining for 3 years. Their subscriber numbers were flat. They were the exact kind of company that should have been using Prism Analytics, but was too arrogant or too bureaucratic to admit they needed outside help. I learned later that James Wu had actually pitched Prism to their executive team 18 months earlier. He'd seen what we were doing, recognized that Consolidated needed exactly what we offered, and put together a proposal for a pilot program. His boss had rejected it without serious consideration. Too expensive, too risky, too willing to admit that some dropout startup understood media better than a company with 40 years of industry experience. Share this video so more people understand that dropping out isn't always failure. Comment justice if you believe the universe has a sense of timing. That rejection would end up costing them everything. The approach came through back channels, the way these things always do. A mutual connection mentioned that Consolidated's board was getting nervous, that activist investors were circling, that there was talk of breaking up the company and selling it for parts. Would Prism be interested in acquiring their analytics division? It was a small part of their business, underperforming and under-resourced, but it would give us their client relationships and enterprise contracts. I took the meeting out of curiosity more than genuine interest. What I discovered was that Consolidated wasn't just struggling, they were dying. Their revenue was down 23% year-over-year. Their best creators were leaving for platforms that actually understood digital audiences. Their ad sales were collapsing as marketers realized that Consolidated couldn't prove their audiences were actually engaged, just that they technically existed. They needed someone to save them, and they were finally desperate enough to consider solutions they'd previously dismissed as beneath them. I made a counteroffer. I didn't want their analytics division. I wanted the entire company. Not because I needed what they had, but because of what it would mean, because of who worked there, because of what I could build from the wreckage of their arrogance. The negotiation took 4 months. Consolidated's board was divided between people who understood they were out of options and people who couldn't accept that a 31-year-old dropout was about to buy the company they'd spent decades building. The activist investors were my unexpected allies. They didn't care about legacy or pride. They cared about returns, and I was offering 40% above the current stock price, a premium that reflected not what Consolidated was worth now, but what it could become once someone who actually understood modern media was running it. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 5 years and 2 months after I'd walked out of that farewell party. I bought Consolidated Media Group for $340 million, a combination of cash, stock, and debt financing that Sarah Chen had helped me structure. Prism Analytics absorbed Consolidated as a subsidiary, and I became the executive chair of the combined entity, which meant I was now technically the boss of everyone who worked at Consolidated Media Group, including Monica, Dylan, and James. I didn't announce it in advance. I didn't send a company-wide email or hold a town hall. I just showed up on my first official day as the new owner, walked through those glass doors, and let them see me. The recognition spread through the office like a shockwave. I watched Monica's face drain of color, watched Dylan actually drop the coffee cup he'd been holding, watched it shatter on the floor, watched James Wu stand up from his desk, his expression cycling through disbelief and horror. I didn't gloat. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked to the conference room where the leadership team was waiting. Through the glass wall, I could see the 3 of them huddled together, probably trying to figure out if this was real. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me, would you have been as strategic as Petra, or would you have confronted them immediately? And if you want more stories about people who turn their biggest humiliations into their greatest victories, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss when karma comes full circle. Because the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming undeniable.